I have stood many posts in the royal house of Harrogate, and I have forgotten most of them the way a man forgets the rungs of a ladder he has already climbed. But there is one morning I have never been able to set down, though 30 years have passed, and I am an old man now with a pension and a garden and grandchildren who think the guard is a costume. That morning I was young. I was 19, 3 months into the black tunic and the tall bearskin, and I stood the inner post at the head of the lily stair, while an older man named Corwin Ashe stood the door of the schoolroom itself. And that was the morning the Queen Consort of Eldermoor gave an order I still cannot repeat without my hands going cold. "Guardsmen," she said, "arrest the Princess Maelin." She said it the way another woman might order a carriage brought round. There was no tremor in it, no heat, nothing that a listener could later point to and call anger. It was the flat, even voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed the instant she finished speaking, and in the 7 years I had been alive to the doings of the great house I had never once heard that voice refused. So I confess my first feeling was not outrage. It was a kind of vertigo, as if the stone under my boots had tilted. Arrest the princess. Arrest a child of 9 who at that very moment was on the other side of the schoolroom door practicing her letters with a slate on her knee, her tongue no doubt caught between her teeth the way it always was when she wrote her RS. Let me set the ground before I set the scene, because a stranger to that house would not understand what balanced on Corwin's next breath. The Princess Maelin was the daughter of the king and of his first wife, the late Queen Isolde, who had died of a fever 3 winters before while Maelin was still small enough to be carried. Isolde had been loved in the way the country loves its own weather, without thinking about it, as a given, as a thing that had always been and would always be. And when she died, the whole realm went quiet in a manner I have not seen since. King Alaric mourned her a year, and then, because a king is not permitted the luxury of grief past its usefulness, he married again. He married the Lady Morwenna of the Westmark, a widow of good blood and better ambition, and she became Queen Consort, and she brought into the palace her own 2 children by her first husband, Lord Cassius, who was then 15 and already too fond of the sound of his own name, and Lady Verena, who was 12 and watched everything from under her lashes like a cat that has learned which servants leave the pantry unlatched. So the nursery of Harrogate held in those years a peculiar arithmetic. There were the king's children by Isolde, the Crown Prince Rowan, who was near grown and rode at his father's side, the Princess Ilara, gentle and quiet, and the 3 little ones Maelin, who was 9, Prince Torin, who was 11 and thought himself a soldier, and Prince Bram, who was 6 and thought himself a puppy. And there were Morwennas too, Cassius and Verena, who were of no blood royal at all, but who lived under the same gilded roof and ate from the same silver, and had begun, in small ways that a footman notices before a king does, to behave as though the roof and the silver were promised to them. I say this not to blacken the Queen Consort before you have heard her. I say it because a house is a set of scales, and everyone in it can feel when a thumb is pressing on one pan. That morning the scales were tilted further than usual, because the king was not in the palace, nor was the crown prince. 3 days before, Alaric had ridden south to the Border Council at the Marches, that yearly gathering where the lords of the frontier renew their oaths and quarrel over rivers, and he had taken Rowan with him to blood the boy in the tedium of statecraft. They were 3 days hard riding away. In their absence, the running of the household fell, by custom, to the Queen Consort, the ordering of the kitchens, the receiving of petitions, the 100 small governances of a palace. But there is a wide gulf, as I would learn before that day was out, between the ordering of kitchens and the ordering of an arrest, and Corwin Ashe stood squarely in that gulf and did not move. "Madam," he said. Only that. He was a big man, Corwin, broad through the shoulder in the way of men who have carried packs across mountains, and his face at rest gave away nothing. It was a wall with a window in it, and the window was shuttered. He had served the guard for 20 years. He had stood at the late Queen Isolde's coffin through the whole of the vigil night without once shifting his weight, and it was whispered among us younger men that Isolde herself had asked for him particularly to stand her children's doors, because she trusted him, and that after her death he had asked to keep the schoolroom post, though it was a post beneath his rank. A man could rise faster elsewhere. Corwin had chosen the door of the dead queen's children, and stood it for 3 years as though it were the gate of heaven. "Madam," he said again, and let the word hang, and did not reach for the door latch, and did not step aside. The Queen Consort was not alone. Behind her in the corridor stood her lady, Mistress Crake, a thin, dry, capable woman with a ring of keys at her waist, and a way of folding her hands that made you feel your collar was crooked. And behind Crake stood 2 men of the outer guard whom I did not know well, housemen who drew their pay and asked few questions. And behind them, half in the shadow of the tapestry, stood Lady Verena, the Queen Consort's daughter, 17 now and grown handsome, holding something against her breast that I could not yet see. I marked her there. I marked that she did not look frightened or grieved, or anything a girl ought to look who has come to see a little sister arrested. She looked, I thought, like a player waiting in the wings for her cue, and the sight of it turned something in my stomach before I had any reason for it. "You have heard me, Guardsman Ashe," Morwenna said. "I do not care to say it a 3rd time. The Princess Maelin is to be taken into the custody of this household and confined to the North Tower for the safety of the crown and the peace of the king's house. You will open that door. You will take her without alarming her overmuch, and you will convey her where Mistress Crake directs. Now, I want you to hear how reasonable she made it sound. Not a dungeon, a tower. Not seized, taken. Without alarming her overmuch. For the safety of the crown. She had wrapped the thing in soft cloth so that a decent man might carry it without feeling the edges. And that, I have come to believe, is the truest mark of the worst orders. They are always dressed as mercy." Corwin's eyes moved once from the Queen to Mistress Crake's keys, to the 2 house guards, to Verena in the shadow, and back to the Queen. It was the only part of him that moved. "On whose warrant, madam?" he asked. The corridor went very still. I heard, faintly through the door, the small scratch of a slate pencil, and a child's voice humming under her breath, some nursery tune with no words I could catch. Maelin, oblivious, 3 feet away and a whole world away, writing her letters while 5 grown people in the corridor decided her mourning. "On mine," said the Queen Consort. "You are not the king, madam," Corwin said. His voice did not rise. If anything, it went quieter so that we all had to hold still to hear it, and holding still we heard it all the better. "Nor his regent. A princess of the blood is not a scullery maid to be sent to the tower on a household word. She answers to the king's justice and to no other. The king is 3 days south. Until he returns, or until his lawful regent commands it, this door does not open to an arrest." "Not by your hand, madam, not by mine." There, that was the sentence. I have heard men make longer speeches and shorter ones. Brave ones shouted from scaffolds and clever ones purred in council chambers. But I have never in my life heard a sentence do more work than those few plain words did in that corridor. Because with them, a guardsman of 20 years' service told the Queen Consort of Eldermoor, to her face, in front of her own people, that she did not have the power she was pretending to have. And he told her without heat, without insolence, as a man reads a rule aloud from a book both of them were supposed to have read. The Queen Consort did not flinch either. I will give her that always. She and Corwin were, in their way, the same kind of animal, the kind that does not show you the wound. "You forget yourself," she said softly. "No, madam," Corwin answered. "I remember myself. That is the whole of the trouble." Mistress Crake's hands unfolded and folded again. The 2 house guards shifted their weight and looked at their boots, because they had been brought to lend the thing the weight of numbers, and numbers are a poor comfort to a man who suddenly finds himself on the wrong side of a locked principle. And I was 19, and my mouth had gone dry, and I understood for the first time in my young life that I was watching something that would not stay small. It had the feel of a stone already rolling. Then Lady Verena stepped out of the shadow of the tapestry, and I saw what she had been holding against her breast. It was a letter. A folded sheet of good paper, cream-colored, and hanging from it on a ribbon was a lump of dark red wax stamped with a seal. And even from my post at the stairhead I knew that seal, because every child of the house was taught it before they were taught their prayers. It was the private signet of the late Queen Isolde, the lily, and the 3 stars, the seal she had used on her own letters, the seal that had gone silent the day she died. "Mother," Verena said, and her voice was pitched to Carrie, gentle and grieved and false as a painted apple. "Perhaps the good guardsman should see the reason before he refuses it. Perhaps then he will understand that we are not cruel, that we would give anything for this not to be true." And she held the letter out toward Corwin Ashe, across the still air of the corridor, as though it were a thing too heavy for her to bear alone. I did not know that morning what was written on that sheet. I did not know that it would take the better part of 2 days, a hard-riding messenger, a frightened scribe, a physician's ledger, and the return of an outraged king to unmake what that folded paper set in motion. I knew only what any boy of 19 knows when the ground tilts, that I had backed the right man, and that backing the right man was about to cost more than I had. Corwin did not take the letter. "Read it to me, my lady," he said, "since you have brought it so far. Read it out here in the light where we can all hear. An accusation that hides in a pocket is not an accusation. It is a knife." And Lady Verena, who had not expected to be asked to perform her lie aloud in a corridor full of witnesses, hesitated for exactly 1 heartbeat too long. I have thought about that heartbeat more than I have thought about anything else in my long life. Everything that came after the tower, the trial that was not a trial, the near ruin of a good man, the fall of a scheming one, all of it turned on the fact that Corwin Ashe would not take a folded lie into his hand, and made them open it in the light instead. But I am ahead of myself, and the morning was not half begun. Verena recovered. Her kind are never off their feet for long. She lifted her chin, unfolded the sheet with fingers that trembled just enough to be seen, and read. "To my dear cousin of the Westmark," she read. "The old king fails faster than they let it be known. When he is gone, my brother Rowan is soft and will be led. See that our friends are placed near him and that the consort's brats— I am sorry, mother, those are the words written— that the consort's brats are put out of the house before they can take root. I have the old seal still. Use it as we agreed. Burn this. Your loving M." She lowered the paper. In the silence you could have heard a moth. "It is sealed with the late Queen with the late Queen's own signet," Verena said, and her voice did the trick of catching as if on grief. "Which the Princess Maelin keeps in a jewel box in her room, though she has been forbidden it a dozen times. It is in the princess's own hand, guardsman. Our tutor will swear to the hand. She has been writing to my mother's enemies in the Westmark, plotting the ruin of this house, and she 9 years old and led by God knows whom. We do not think it is her doing. We think she is being used. That is why the tower, to keep her safe, and away from whoever puts these words in her head, until the king comes home and can judge it gently. It was, I must tell you, a beautiful piece of work. I did not know then how beautiful, but I could feel the shape of it even at 19. It accused and pitied in the same breath. It made the arrest into a rescue. It gave the girl an invisible puppeteer, so that no one need quite believe a child capable of treason, while everyone agreed she must be locked away from the danger of it. And it was signed with a dead woman's seal, so that even the grave seemed to be giving evidence. Corwin Ashe listened to all of it without moving. When Verena finished, he was quiet a moment, and then he said something I did not expect. "Whose hand wrote the letter I do not know," he said. "But I knew the woman whose seal is on it, my lady. I stood her door for 11 years and her coffin for 1 night, and I will tell you a thing about Queen Isolde that perhaps you are too young to have marked. She never in her life spelled the word cousin the way your letter spells it. She wrote it in the old-fashioned, with the older ending, because her mother had taught her so and she was proud of it. I carried 100 of her notes to the kitchen and the stables. I know her hand and her spellings the way I know my own name. Whoever wrote that letter did not know the woman they were pretending to be, and whoever sealed it with her signet had that signet to hand, which is a thing worth asking after, since it was buried, my lady. Locked in the memorial casket in the crypt with her wedding ring and her book of hours, 3 winters gone, by the king's own order, and I stood the crypt door while it was done. I did not understand in that moment how large a stone he had just turned over. Neither, I think, did most of the corridor. But I saw Mistress Crake's hands go still, truly still, not folded, just still. And I saw the smallest flicker cross the Queen Consort's face, gone as fast as a fish under ice, and I understood that Corwin had said something that was not in anyone's plan. Because if the letter was sealed with Isolde's signet, and Isolde's signet was locked in her tomb, then someone had opened the tomb, and a child of 9 does not open a royal crypt. "You are a doorkeeper," the Queen Consort said at last, and now there was frost on it, "and you have appointed yourself a judge. That is a long way to fall in one morning, Guardsman Ashe. I have shown you a courtesy in explaining what I need not explain to a servant at all. It ends now. Stand aside, or you will be taken from this post in irons, and another set in your place who remembers that his oath is to obey." "My oath," Corwin said, "is to the king and to the king's peace. I have it by heart, madam, having sworn it before you came to this house. It does not contain the word obey. It contains the word protect. If you wish a man who will open a princess's door on your word alone, you are right that you must find another, for I am not him and never was. But you will not find him among the king's own guard, because we all swore the same words, and any man who tells you otherwise is telling you what you wish to hear, which is a different trade than mine. I have set that down as near to exact as 30 years allow. It was the longest I ever heard Corwin Ashe speak at one time, before or since, and every word of it was a stone laid in a wall." The Queen Consort turned to the 2 house guards. "Take him," she said. And here is where I learned what a house is made of, because those 2 men, housemen, paymen, the kind we younger guards privately scorned, those 2 men looked at Corwin Ashe standing his post with his hand nowhere near his weapon and his eyes forward, and 20 years of the black tunic on his back, and they did not move. One of them, the older, a gray-mustached fellow named Dunkel, whom I later came to like very much, actually took half a step backward, as though the Queen had asked him to lay hands on a cathedral. "Madam," Dunkel mumbled, "he's guard, inner guard." We can't take inner guard off a royal door, madam, not without the captain's word. There's an order to these things." "Then fetch the captain," Morwenna snapped, and the frost cracked at last, and under it I heard for one instant the sound of a woman who had expected this to take 4 minutes and was watching it become the longest morning of her life. "Fetch Captain Thorne. He at least understands the chain he stands in." That too I have thought about for 30 years. Fetch the captain. Because she said it as one who already knew what the captain would say, and she was not wrong, and that was the darkest hour of the whole affair, darker than the corridor, darker than the tower. It was the moment I understood that the rot did not stop at the Queen Consort's 2 house men. It went up. Dunkel went, grateful to be gone, and while we waited, the Queen, her lady, her daughter, the one remaining house guard, Corwin at the door and I at the stairhead with my heart going like a hammer. The schoolroom door opened from the inside, because a child of 9 has good ears and had heard her own name said too many times through an inch of oak. Maelin stood in the doorway with her slate still in her hand. She was small for 9, dark-haired like her mother, with her mother's straight brows that made her look grave even when she was not, and a smudge of chalk on her cheek. She looked at the corridor full of grown people, and she did the thing that children of that house were trained to do, which was to drop the beginning of a curtsy to the Queen Consort. And then she stopped in the middle of it, because she had read the room the way children read rooms, faster and truer than we credit them. And the curtsy died half-made, and she straightened up and looked, of all the faces there, at Corwin. Ashe, she said, not a title, just his name the way she'd said it every morning for 3 years. Ashe, what's wrong? I watched a wall with a shuttered window in it try to answer a 9-year-old, and I watched the shutter open just a crack, and I will remember that crack when I have forgotten my own children's faces. Nothing that concerns you yet, Highness, Corwin said. Go back to your letters. Finish your R. I heard you fighting it through the door. It won't sit down, Maelin said, of the letter R, with a 9-year-old's grave despair. And for one heartbeat the whole poisoned corridor was undone by the enormous fact of a child who could not make her R sit down. Then the Queen Consort said, Maelin, come here to me, child, in a voice like warm milk, and put out her hand. And Corwin Ashe, who had not moved from the door in all this time, moved at last. He did not touch the princess. He did not do anything a painter could have shown you. He simply shifted his weight, one boot, a hand's breadth, so that his body came between the child in the doorway and the woman with the outstretched hand, and he did it so smoothly that it might have been nothing, and it was everything. It was the whole of the law of that house rendered in 6 inches of polished leather. Highness, he said to Maelin, without turning his head from the Queen, into the room and shut the door and put the bar across. Do it now and quickly, the way we practiced for the fire drill. Go. He had, I learned later, drilled all 3 of the little ones on that bar. A game, he'd made it, a race, for exactly no reason he could have named at the time, in the patient animal way that good guardsmen prepare for weathers they cannot see. And because he had made a game of it 3 years running, Maelin did not argue and did not weep and did not freeze. She stepped back and swung the heavy door, and I heard the old bar drop into its bracket with a sound like a full stop at the end of a sentence. The Queen Consort's outstretched hand closed on nothing. You have just, she said very quietly, committed a crime, guardsman. I have just, Corwin said, kept a child from being carried off on a forged letter sealed with a stolen signet, while the king is 3 days south and cannot say me nay or yea. If that is a crime, madam, then I will answer for it to the king's own mouth and to no lesser one. Fetch the captain. Fetch the chamberlain. Fetch the whole house. I will stand this door until a man with the lawful right to relieve me tells me to my face that I am relieved. And there is no such man within 3 days' ride, and we both know it. And that, and here, only here, did something almost like feeling come into his voice. That, madam, is precisely why this morning was chosen. The corridor held its breath. Somewhere below, on the stair I guarded, I heard the ring of boots coming up 2 at a time. Captain Thorne, answering the summons. And I, 19 years old and shaking, straightened my back and set my eyes forward and prepared to find out what my captain was made of. He was made, it turned out, of softer stuff than a doorkeeper, but I am getting ahead again. Captain Roderick Thorne came up the lily stair with Dunkel trailing behind him, and I saluted, and he passed me without a glance, which was not like him, because Thorne was a courteous man who knew the names of his youngest recruits and made a point of using them. He did not use mine that morning. He went straight to the knot of people at the schoolroom door, and he took in the scene, the Queen, the lady, the barred door, Corwin planted before it. And I watched his face do a thing I had not known a face could do, which was to arrange itself into command, while the eyes behind it went sick with dread. What is this? He said. It was not a question. It was a man buying 3 seconds. Your guardsman has refused a direct order from the Queen Consort of Eldermoor, said Morwenna, and has barred a princess of the blood into a room against the wishes of the household, and has as good as called my daughter a forger and me a thief, before witnesses. I have asked twice that he be taken from this post. Twice your men have found reasons not to. I am asking you now, Captain. I trust I will not have to ask a 4th time, or wonder aloud, when the king returns, Why his captain of the guard could not enforce a lawful order in his own house. There it was, the whole weight of her brought down on one point, like a woman standing all her substance on the tip of an awl. When the king returns. She used the king like a cudgel, and the beauty of it was that Thorn could not know which way the king would break. If Alaric came home and believed the letter, then the man who had refused to arrest the little traitor would hang, and so would the captain who let him. If Alaric came home and did not believe it, but she was betting he would not dare that gamble, and she had chosen a soft man to bet it on. Corwin, Thorn said low, almost pleading. Corwin, stand down. Let her have the door. Will the girl comes to no harm, it's the North Tower, not a cell. There'll be a fire lit and her own maid. We put her there safe, and we send word to the king this same hour, and we let him sort the rights of it. That's the sensible course. You've made your objection, man, it's noted. I'll write it down myself, but you cannot hold a royal door against the consort with the king away. It's mutiny. Do you hear me? They'll call it mutiny, and there's not a thing I can do to stop the word once it's said. And I thought, God forgive me, at 19 I thought it that Thorn was right. It was the sensible course. The tower, not a cell. A fire lit. Word to the king. Let a wiser man sort it. Every reasonable bone in my body leaned toward it because it promised that the terrible thing could be made smaller, could be set down gently, could be nobody's fault. That is the exact voice, I have since learned, that has talked more decent men into more shameful acts than all the cruelty in the world. The voice that says, be reasonable. Split the difference, the tower, not a cell. Corwin Ashe did not lean toward it at all. You'll write my objection down, he said. Good. Write this down with it. Ask them why the tower and not the king's own study, where she might be kept just as safe under lock, close by in the light, where the Chamberlain passes 20 times a day. Ask them why a 9-year-old accused of treason must be put half a mile off behind 3 doors with the consort's own maid, and not 1 door down under the eyes of the whole house. Ask them, Roderick, and then tell me it's the sensible course, because I have asked myself that question since the word tower was first said, and I can find only one answer, and the answer is that a girl in the North Tower can be reached, and a girl in the king's study cannot. That is what the tower is for. It was never about her safety. It was about who holds the only key. I saw Thorn hear it. I saw it land. And I saw him decide in the way weak men decide, which is by not deciding by looking at the floor. Take the door, Thorn said to Dunkel and the other, not meeting anyone's eye. 2 of you. Ashe is relieved. Escort him to the barrack and hold him there pending the king's return. Gently, he's a good man having a bad morning. Nobody moved. It was the second time that morning that men had been ordered to lay hands on Corwin Ashe and had found they could not, and this time it was worse for Thorn, because these were not the Queen's house men. Dunkel was guard. The other, a lean young fellow named Pruitt, was guard, of my own intake, a boy I'd shared a bench with. And Guardsman Pruitt looked at Guardsman Ashe standing his post exactly as we had all been taught to stand it, flawless, unmoved, eyes forward, the very picture on the recruiting bill, and Pruitt's hand would not go to him. It hung at his side like a dead thing. I understood, watching him, that the palace had spent 20 years and a great deal of money teaching us to revere precisely the thing Corwin was doing, and that you cannot spend 20 years teaching a boy to worship a stone and then order him to break it. Captain, Pruitt said, and his voice cracked on it, I can't, sir. He hasn't done anything but stand his post. You're asking me to arrest a man for standing his post. I am asking you, Thorn began, and got no further, because it was at that moment that a new voice came up the stair, dry and amused and entirely unhurried, and everything changed for the first time. Now here, said the voice, is a great many people crowded outside a schoolroom. Has someone finally taught the parrot to swear? I should like to hear it. Lord Halbrecht, the Lord Chamberlain of Harrogate, came up into the corridor at the pace of a man who has never once in his life been made to hurry. He was old, older than Corwin by 20 years, round and slow, and given to jokes that were funnier to himself than to anyone else, and most of the young guard thought him a comfortable relic who existed to arrange the seating at banquets. I thought so myself that morning, up until the moment he stopped smiling. He took the scene in over the tops of his spectacles. The Queen, the lady with the keys, the letter in Verena's hand, the barred door, Corwin at his post and Thorn caught between them, and the two guardsmen with their dead hands and me quaking at the stairhead. "Ah," said Lord Halbrecht, and the amusement drained out of his face like water out of a cracked jug, and left something underneath it that was much older and much harder. "Ah, it's this." "You know of this," the Queen Consort said sharply. "I know of a great many things, madam. It is the whole of my office and the whole of my tedium," Halbrecht said. "I know that a princess of the blood may not be confined save on the king's warrant or his regent's, and that neither warrant exists in this palace this morning, for I keep the seal book and I should have had to enter it. I know that the North Tower was aired and a fire laid in it yesterday, before, I think, any crime had yet been discovered, which is a very forward-looking sort of housekeeping, Mistress Crake. You are to be commended. And I know that I am too old and too fond of my own skin to enjoy standing in this corridor, but I find that I am standing in it. Isn't that curious?" He looked at Corwin. "Guardsman Ashe, you've barred the child in." "Yes, my lord." "With the drill you made of it, the fire game." "Yes, my lord." "Good," said Halbrecht softly. "Good man. I told her mother you'd earn your keep one day." And then, to the Queen Consort, in a voice that had put away all its jokes, "Madam, I am going to be a very great nuisance to you now, and I am going to enjoy it, because I have been a courtier for 50 years, and it is a rare gift to reach the end of one's usefulness and discover one still has a use. There will be no arrest in this house today. Not by your warrant, which does not exist, and not by the captain's order, which he does not have the authority to give against a royal person, whatever he may believe in his fright. If you wish the Princess Maelin confined, you will wait for the king, and you will lay your letter and your seal and your grieving daughter before him, and he will judge it. And if it please God he judges it as I think he will, then someone in this corridor will spend the rest of a short life regretting that a crypt was opened. I want to tell you that this ended it. It did not. It was not even the middle, but it was the moment the tide first turned under our feet, the moment I understood that Corwin Ashe standing one door had bought just enough time for one old courtier to smell the truth and plant his slow bulk in the way of the lie, and that a scheme which needed everyone to move quickly and quietly was now being made to move slowly and loudly, in the light, with witnesses, which is the one thing such schemes cannot survive. The Queen Consort understood it too. I saw her measure the corridor, the barred door she could not open, the guardsmen she could not command, the Chamberlain she could not silence, the captain she could not lean on hard enough, and I saw her do the only thing a truly dangerous person does when the small crime fails. She reached for a larger one. "Very well," she said, and her calm came back over her like a tide coming back over a rock. "We will wait for the king. Since you are all so tender of the law, we will send to him this very hour. I will send, Captain, by my own rider, and you may send by yours, so that no one need doubt the message. And when His Majesty reads what his little daughter has been writing to his enemies, and hears that his Chamberlain and his guardsmen stood in a corridor and barred the door against her own family's care of her, he will judge all of it. All of it, my lord. The letter and the seal and the door and the men who held it." She smiled, and it was a smile with a plan behind it. "I am content to be judged by the king. Are you?" And with that she gathered her lady and her daughter and her useless housemen, and swept back down the corridor the way she had come, leaving the letter's accusation hanging in the air behind her like smoke, and leaving me and Corwin and Halbrecht and the two shamed guardsmen, and a barred door with a 9-year-old behind it, to understand that we had won the corridor and not yet the war, and that the war would now be fought 3 days south, in the ear of a king, on a battlefield none of us could reach in time. Unless someone rode. It was Halbrecht who said it plain. Once the corridor had emptied of the Queen's party, and only we of the house were left. He drew Corwin and the captain, and, to my astonishment, me, the boy at the stairhead, into the little muniment room off the schoolroom passage, and shut the door, and sat himself down heavily on a clerk's stool that creaked in protest. "She will send a rider south to the king," he said, "and her rider will carry her tale, and it will be a good tale, well told, 3 days in the telling with no one to answer it. That is her true weapon, not the letter, the story. By the time we could put our own account into the king's hands, hers will have had 3 days to set like plaster. We cannot outrun her to the king. Her horses are as good as ours, and the road is the same road." He took off his spectacles and polished them on his sleeve, which I would learn was the thing he did when he was thinking hardest. "So we do not race her to the king. We go to the nearer authority." "There is no nearer authority," Thorne said dully. "The crown prince is with the king. There's no regent named. There is the king's sister," said Halbrecht. And I felt the room change. The Princess Adela was the king's elder sister, a widow, who kept her own household at the dower manor of Ravenscliffe, half a day's ride to the west. She was not regent. No woman of that house had ever been named regent. But she was a princess of the blood royal, senior in years to the king himself, and she held, by an old and half-forgotten grant, the office of warden of the royal nursery, a title that had for 2 generations meant nothing but the right to a good seat at christenings. Nothing, that is, until a morning came when someone tried to remove a royal child from the nursery on a forged word, and the ancient grant woke up and showed its teeth. "The warden of the nursery," Halbrecht said, turning the old words over with relish, "may inquire into the care and keeping of any child of the blood, and may stay any hand laid upon them pending the king's justice. It is written in the nursery charter, which I have read, Madam Consort has not, and which has sat gathering dust in my seal book for 30 years waiting for precisely this. Adela can stop the thing lawfully here today without waiting 3 days for her brother. And Adela," the old man's mouth curved, "has never in 50 years been charmed by anyone, least of all by a Westmark widow with ambitions. If we can get her here before the Queen finds a way past the charter, we hold the field." "Half a day's ride there," Corwin said. "Half a day back if she comes at once. She could be here by nightfall." "If she comes at once, if the rider gets through." "And if the Queen does not in the meanwhile find some way to open a barred door." Halbrecht looked at me then, the boy, and I think he chose me precisely because I was the boy, young, light, unremarkable, the sort of messenger no one thinks to stop. "You, guardsman, what's your name?" "Wystan Row, my lord," I said. "Can you ride, Wystan Row?" "Since before I could walk, my lord. My father kept the post horses at Millbrook." "Then you are the most important man in this palace for the next 12 hours, and I envy you because you get to do something, and I get to stay here and be clever at people, which is far more tiring." He was already scrawling on a scrap of paper, folding it, reaching for his own seal, the Chamberlain seal, which no one could forge because it never left his person. "You will not go to the stables, they'll be watched. You'll go out the postern by the laundry. You'll take my own gray mare from the far paddock. She's fast and she's fresh, and no one will think to look for her gone. You'll ride to Ravenscliffe, and you'll put this into the Princess Adela's own hand and no one else's, and you'll tell her in these words, 'The nursery is breached and the warden is needed.' Say it back to me. 'The nursery is breached and the warden is needed.' Again. 'The nursery is breached and the warden is needed.' Good lad. Go now, and God ride with you, and do not stop for anyone wearing the consort's badge, whatever they tell you. If they say the little princess is asking for you, it's a lie, she doesn't know you exist. Go." I went. And because this is Corwin's story and not mine, I will not spend long on my own ride, though I could, on the gray mare who ran like her tail was on fire, on the cold that got into my hands past feeling, on the 2 Westmark outriders I saw on the West Road, and left behind by cutting across the water meadows my father had poached in as a boy. On the moment I first saw the towers of Ravenscliff against a bruised evening sky, and knew I would make it. I will say only that I rode as I have never ridden since, because I had seen a man stand a door against a queen for a child who could not make her sit down, and I was 19, and I would have ridden into the sea for him. What I did not see, being on the road, was what happened in the palace while I rode. Corwin told me the most of it years later in his garden, and old Halbrecht told me the rest before he died, and I have pieced it together into one telling, and it is this. They did not merely wait. Halbrecht was not a man to sit on his clever hands. While I rode west, he went to work in the palace, and his first work was the crypt. For the letter, you will recall, was sealed with the late Queen Isolde's private signet, and Corwin had sworn that signet was locked in her memorial casket in the crypt, sealed there by the king's own order 3 winters gone. If that was true, then the seal on the letter was impossible, unless the crypt had been opened. And so, quietly, with 2 trustworthy men and the sexton, Lord Halbrecht went down into the cold under the chapel with a lantern, and he found the memorial casket, and he found that the wax that sealed it, the king's wax, stamped 3 years before, was intact and unbroken. For 1 black hour that looked like the ruin of everything. If the casket was sealed and the signet was inside it, then how was the signet also on the letter? Had Corwin been wrong? Was there a second signet, an unofficial copy? And if there was, then the whole tower of the defense fell down, because then the seal proved nothing and the letter might stand. This was the false dawn, or rather, the false dusk, for it came on with the dark, and I have always thought that fitting. Halbrecht sat down on a cold stone step in the crypt with the sealed casket at his knee, and by his own account, very nearly gave it up. An old man, tired in the dark, with the one piece of evidence he'd been so proud of turned to sand in his hands, and the Queen's story hardening into plaster 3 days south, and the boy he'd sent for the warden perhaps already taken on the west road for all he knew. It was Corwin who would not let it lie. Corwin had not gone down to the crypt. Corwin was still standing the schoolroom door, had not left it, would not leave it, had eaten standing and would sleep standing if it came to that, because he had told the Queen to her face that he would hold that post until a lawful man relieved him, and he was not a man who said things he did not mean. But when Halbrecht came up from the crypt gray-faced and told him the casket was sealed, Corwin was quiet a while, and then he asked one question, the question that unmade the whole beautiful scheme, and it was this. "My lord, when was it sealed?" "3 years ago, I told you, the king's own wax and the date beneath it." "No," said Corwin, "not when does the wax say it was sealed. When was it sealed? Who stood the crypt when the casket went in, and who has stood it since, and has that seal ever in 3 years been off the door of the crypt itself? Not the casket, the crypt, for an hour when no honest man was watching." And Halbrecht, who was old and clever and had been looking at the wrong wax, went very still, because he saw it. The casket seal was intact. Of course it was intact. Anyone clever enough to plan this was clever enough to reseal a casket with a stolen stamp. The question was never whether the casket had been opened. The question was whether anyone had had the crypt to themselves long enough to open it, lift the signet, and seal it up again at leisure. And that was a question with a keeper, and the keeper was the sexton, and the sexton was an honest frightened old man who, when Halbrecht put it to him gently in the chapel with a lantern between them, remembered the way people remember when they are asked the right question at last, that yes, there had been a night the winter past, when the Queen Consort's own confessor had asked, as a kindness, for the crypt to be left open and unwatched from vespers to matins, so that a grieving lady of the household might keep a private vigil at the late Queen's tomb, undisturbed, all night, alone. A private vigil, alone all night, at the tomb where the signet lay. And the grieving lady, Halbrecht asked very quietly. "Mistress Crake, my lord," said the sexton. The Queen's own Mistress Crake. She was that fond of the late Queen, everyone said. Cried the whole time, the girl that brought her the candle said. Went in weeping and came out weeping. Came out weeping, Halbrecht thought, with a dead Queen's signet in her weeping hand. And here is why the scheme was so nearly perfect. Knowing it and proving it were two different countries, and the road between them ran through a king 3 days away who had not yet heard one word of any of it, and through a barred door that could not stay barred forever, and through a boy on a gray mare of whom, that night, no one in the palace had any word at all. There was one more thing that happened in the palace that night while I rode, and I set it down here because it is the part of the story that Corwin himself would never tell without being pressed, and I had to have it from Halbrecht in the end, and from a footman named Asle who saw it, before I understood how near the whole thing came to ruin in the dark hours when no one was meant to be watching. For the Queen Consort did not, in truth, sit quietly and wait for the king. That had been theater, the sweeping off down the corridor, the grand contentment to be judged. What she did, once the palace was asleep and the Chamberlain was down in the crypt chasing his sealed casket, and there was no rider yet back from anywhere, was try the door one more time, quietly in the deep of the night, when a tired man is at his weakest, and there are no witnesses of rank to shame the hands that do the work. They came at the 2nd hour past midnight. Not the Queen herself. She was far too careful for that, but Mistress Crake and 3 of the outer house men, and they came with a story ready-made, which was that the captain had reconsidered and sent them to relieve the guardsman Ashe so that he might rest. Poor man, he'd been on his feet a day, only humane. And Corwin, who had been a day and a night without sleep and knew exactly what he was, looked at the 4 of them in the low light of the corridor lamps and said, "The captain will relieve me to my face, in daylight or not at all. Go back to your beds." "He's asleep," Crake said. "He'll not thank us for waking him over a doorman's pride. Be sensible, Ashe. We'll take good care of the little princess. You've made your point and the whole palace has marked it. There's no shame in resting now." "There's no shame in it," Corwin agreed. "There's only the fact that I won't. Go back to your beds, mistress, and take these 3 with you, for they've the good sense to be ashamed already, which is more than I can say for the errand." One of the 3, this is the part Asle the footman saw, crouched on the servant's stair where he'd been sent for milk for a sleepless child, and had frozen at the sound of voices. One of the 3 house men put his hand to Corwin's shoulder to move him, the way you'd move a man rather than fight him, testing whether the great stone was as tired as it looked. And Corwin let him take the grip, and did not shrug it off, and said only, very low, so that Asle on the stair had to hold his breath to catch it, "You have a wife in the laundry court, Harl. I've seen you walk her home. When the king comes back, and he is coming back, there will be an accounting of every hand that touched this door tonight, and I would not have your wife's husband on the wrong end of it over 40 crowns of Crake's money. Take your hand off my shoulder and go home to her, and in the morning you'll be a man who guarded a princess, not one who carried her off. It's the same hour of your life either way, only the name of it changes. Choose the better name." And Harl the houseman took his hand off Corwin Ashe's shoulder and stepped back, and after a moment he said, "I," in a voice like a man waking, and he turned and went, and the other 2 went after him, and Mistress Crake was left standing alone in the corridor with her keys and her lie and no one at all to work them. She stood a long moment. Then she said something I will not repeat, low and vicious, the only time in the whole affair that any of the schemers let the mask drop entire, and she went too. That was the last assault on the schoolroom door. It was turned back not with a blow but with a sentence, Corwin reaching past the errand to the man sent on it, and handing him back his own better self, which is a thing I have tried and mostly failed to learn to do in the 30 years since, and which I think was the truest weapon that patient, unmoving man ever carried. He did not do it alone through that long night, either, though he would have. Twice the little Prince Torrin, 11 years old and his father's son to the bone, slipped out of the nursery in his nightshirt and came and stood beside Corwin at the door, small and furious and cold, and announced that he would stand guard too, because his sister was in there and that made it his post. And twice Corwin, who could not leave the door to carry the boy back, talked him into going instead of ordering him, which is harder, told him that the bravest guard is the one who holds the second post, the reserve, and that Torrhen's post was the nursery, where little Bram was frightened and needed a soldier, and that a good soldier goes where he is most needed and not where the fighting looks finest. And Torrhen, who wanted so badly to be brave that he could be steered by the word, went back both times and stood over his sleeping baby brother like a sentry, and I have always thought that the house of Harrogate was luckier than it deserved that night in the children Isolde had left it. A girl who told the truth about a thimble, and a boy who could be sent to guard a nursery. They were their mothers, root and branch. It was the one thing all the forging in the world could not counterfeit. By the grey before dawn Corwin Ashe had held the door through the worst of it, and could not know, whether the boy Wystan Roe had reached Ravenscliff, or been taken on the road, or lay in a ditch with a foundered horse. He knew only that if the warden did not come, the morning would bring the Queen again, rested and lawyered and patient, and that he could not stand the door another full day, and that when he fell the door would open. He stood it anyway. That is the whole of what I learned from him in the end, standing in a corridor at 19 and in a garden at 50, that you hold the door not because you are sure help is coming, but because holding it is the right thing, and the rightness does not depend on the help. The help either comes or it doesn't. The door is yours either way. The help came. I brought it. But he had already decided to hold whether I came or not, and that decision, made alone in the dark with no witness but a footman on a stair, is the realest thing in this whole account, and the reason I have never been able to set it down until now. I reached Ravenscliff at full dark, and I will tell you that the Princess Adela did not keep me waiting. I had expected, I hardly know what I had expected. Grand doors and chamberlains of her own, and an hour cooling my heels while my message climbed some ladder of importance. Instead, a steward took one look at me, a boy in guard black-gray to the eyebrows with road mud and swaying on my feet, and had me into a warm hall and in front of the princess before I had got my breath. She was sitting by a fire with a book and a hound and a glass of something dark, an old woman with the king's own straight brows, and a face that had plainly never in its life pretended to feel a thing it did not feel, and she looked up at me over the book and said, "You've killed a horse getting here, by the look of you. It had better be worth a horse." "The nursery is breached, my lady," I said, the way Halbrecht had made me say it, "and the warden is needed," and I put his sealed paper into her hand. She read it once. I watched her read it. I watched a woman of 70 years read 6 lines and become, between one breath and the next, something I had no word for at 19 and have only one word for now, which is dangerous. She set down the book. She set down the glass. She stood, and the hound stood with her, and she said to her steward without any raising of her voice at all, "My traveling cloak, the closed carriage and the 4 best horses, and rouse Sir Bardolph and 6 men to ride escort, and do it in the time it takes me to reach the door, for I am going to the palace tonight, and God help the woman who has made me leave my fire." We reached Harrogate an hour before dawn. I will never forget coming back into that corridor at the head of the lily stair behind the Princess Adela, and seeing Corwin Ashe still standing the schoolroom door. A full day and a full night he had stood it. His eyes were red-rimmed, and his face was gray with the particular grayness of a man who has not sat down in 20 hours, and he was as straight as the doorpost beside him, straighter, and when he saw the princess he did the thing I had never once seen him do in 3 years of standing near him. He came off his post. He took 1 pace forward, and he went down on 1 knee to her, right there in the corridor, and he said, "Your Highness, Warden, I could not hold it much longer. I am glad you have come." "You held it long enough," Adela said, and she put her old hand flat on the crown of his bowed head for a moment, a thing I think she had not done to any man in a long time, which is all any of us is ever asked. Get up, guardsman. You've earned a chair, and by God you'll have one, but not yet. First you'll open that door and let me see the child everyone in this palace has been so busy protecting that no one has thought to ask her a single question. They unbarred the door, and Maelin, who had spent a night and a day behind it with her maid and her slate, understanding more than they thought and less than she feared, came out and saw an old woman she barely knew, and did the half-curtsy again, and again stopped it in the middle, and then Adela knelt down, 70 years old, knees cracking like green wood, to be level with her and said, "Do you know who I am, child?" "You're my Aunt Adela," Maelin whispered, "Papa's sister. You gave me a silver thimble at the midwinter, and I lost it, and I've been afraid to tell you." "Keep being afraid of it, it builds character," said Adela gravely. "Now, I am going to ask you some questions, and you are going to tell me the truth, all of it, even the parts that make you look bad, because I am old and I have no patience left for anything but the truth. Did you write a letter to anyone in the Westmark?" "No," said Maelin. "Do you have your mother's seal, the lily and the stars, in a box in your room?" The child's face did a complicated thing. "I did," she said. "A little one, not the real one. The real one went with Mama. A little copy Verena gave me. She said it was so I could feel close to Mama. She gave it to me at Candlemas and told me to keep it secret. It was our secret, and to keep it in my jewel box and never show it, and I did. I never showed anyone, and then the child stopped, and I watched her arrive all by herself at the edge of a thing too big for 9 years old. And then they said I stole it. But I didn't. Verena gave it to me. Why would Verena give me a thing and then say I stole it?" Out of the mouths of children. The whole scheme, laid bare by a 9-year-old in 11 words, in a corridor at dawn, because that is where the thread was always going to snap, at the one place the schemers could not control, which was the honesty of the very child they had chosen as their victim. Verena had given her the copied signet. Verena had told her to keep it secret and hidden. And then Verena had produced a forged letter sealed with that very signet, and pointed to the hidden box and said, "See, she has the seal, she hid it, she is guilty." A trap built months in advance, baited with a dead mother's love, sprung on a child too small to see the shape of it. I have met a great many wicked people in a long life, but I have rarely met a wickedness as patient as that one, and I have never forgiven it. Adela heard it all with a face like a closed fist. Then she rose, knees cracking again, and she said to Halbrecht, "Where is the copy, the little seal she was given?" "In the jewel box still, my lady. We've touched nothing." "Fetch it, and fetch me the letter. And fetch me the person who made the letter, because a 9-year-old did not write those words, and neither, I think, did the Lady Verena, who by her mother's account can barely spell her own titles. Someone was paid to forge a dead queen's hand. Find me the hand that held the pen." And here the last stone turned over, and it turned because of Corwin Ashe, who, even gray and swaying, and a night without sleep, had one more thing to give. "The words, Highness," he said. "In the letter, whoever wrote it did not know the late queen spelled cousin in the old fashion. But there is one man in this palace who copies the old fashion, because it is his trade to copy old things, the archivist's under-clerk, the scribe Pell, who was set 3 years ago to copy out the late queen's letters into the memorial book, every one of them in her own hand and her own spellings, as a keepsake for the children. He had them all before him for a year. He is the only man in Harrogate who could forge her hand, and the only one who would spell cousin the new way from habit and not catch it, being a copyist and not a scholar. If you want your forger, my lady, you will find him at the archivist's desk, and I will wager my post he has been paid lately in coin he cannot account for." They found Pell trying to leave by the Watergate with a purse too heavy for an under-clerk, and a face too frightened to lie, and he was weeping before Sir Bardolph's men had walked him 20 steps back up the hill. And he told the whole of it in the archivist's own room with the memorial book open on the desk between him and the Princess Adela, as his accuser and his evidence both. He had been paid by Mistress Crake, on the Queen Consort's word, to forge the letter in the late Queen's hand, and seal it with the signet Crake had taken from the tomb. And God help him, he had done it. 40 gold crowns and a promise of a warmer post, and he had spelled cousin the modern way without a second thought. And that one habit of an honest trade turned to a dishonest end had hanged the whole conspiracy on a single wrongly spelled word. By full morning of the second day, it was no longer a question of whether the Queen Consort's story would set like plaster in the king's ear. It was a question of what the king would do when he arrived to find his sister sitting in his own audience chamber with a forger, a frightened lady's maid, a sexton, a copied seal, a memorial book, and a 9-year-old daughter. And the king was coming, because Adela's own fastest rider had gone south past the Queen's rider in the night, carrying not a story but a summons under the warden's seal. Your daughter is falsely accused, and your house is not as you left it. Come home. He came home hard. He came home, we learned, having read Adela's summons and then the Queen's tale one after the other on the South Road, and having said not one word to anyone for the last 10 miles, which those who rode with him said was more frightening than any rage. King Alaric of Eldermoor rode into his own courtyard on a lathered horse at noon of the second day, with the Crown Prince Rowan at his side and the dust of 80 miles on him. And he did not go to his wife, and he did not go to his chamber. He went to the schoolroom. I was there. I had not slept, and I would not be moved from that corridor for anything short of the king himself, and so it was the king himself who moved me, by arriving. He came up the lily stair too at a time the way I had heard Thorn come up it a day and a half before, only where Thorn had come up afraid, the king came up like weather. And at the top he stopped, because Corwin Ashe was still standing the schoolroom door. Still, after a day and 2 nights. Gray as ash, swaying so slightly you had to have watched him as long as I had to see it, but on his feet at his post, eyes forward, rifle grounded, the very last unbroken thing in a house full of broken ones. The king looked at him for a long moment. "Guardsman," he said, "how long have you held this door?" "Since yesterday morning, Majesty," Corwin said. "When the Queen Consort ordered me to arrest the Princess Maelin, and I found I could not." "You disobeyed the Queen Consort." "I did, Majesty." "You barred my daughter into a room against the wishes of her family." "I did, Majesty." "You laid hands, in a manner of speaking, on the ordering of my household while I was absent, and you set my Chamberlain and my sister against my wife, and you have thrown this palace into an uproar that I could hear from the outer gate." The king's voice did not rise. It was, I realized with a chill, the very same flatness the Queen Consort had used the morning before, the flatness of the truly powerful, that needs no volume. "Have I the shape of it right, guardsman?" "You have the shape of it, Majesty," Corwin said, "not the meaning." "But the shape." "Then give me the meaning. And choose your words, Ashe, for I have ridden 80 miles on 2 stories that cannot both be true, and yours is the third, and I am out of patience for stories." And Corwin Ashe, who had told the Queen Consort more words in one morning than I heard him say in a year, gave the King of Eldermoor the fewest. "An order came to arrest a princess of the blood," he said, "on no warrant but the consort's word, while you and your regent were 3 days south and could say nothing to it. The pretext was a letter in the late Queen's hand, sealed with the late Queen's signet, a signet locked in her tomb by your own order, which I stood the door to see done. A letter she could not have written, sealed with a seal she could not have reached, accusing a child of 9 of treason, so that the child might be carried to a far tower and held there, past your reach, on the say-so of the one who held the only key. I did not know all of that yesterday morning, Majesty. I knew only that the order was not lawful and the letter was not right, and that if I opened the door I would never get it shut again in time. So I did not open it. That is the meaning. I held a door for a day and 2 nights so that the truth could ride to Ravenscliff and back before a lie could ride to you and set. Everything else your sister has waiting for you in your audience chamber, the forger, the maid, the sexton, the copied seal. I only held the door." The king was silent. Then he did the thing that made the whole realm love him. The thing I have told my grandchildren 100 times, though they think it a costume. King Alaric of Eldermoor, dust of 80 miles still on him, reached out and unbarred his own daughter's schoolroom door with his own hands. And when Maelin came flying out of it and into him, he went down on his knees on the cold stone to catch her, king or no king, and he held her. And over the top of her dark head he looked at Corwin Ashe and he said, "Then you did not disobey me, guardsmen. You obeyed me. You obeyed the oath I gave you when I gave you that tunic, which was to protect the king's peace and the king's blood when the king himself was not there to do it. That is the whole of what the oath is for. Any man can obey a king who is standing in front of him. It takes a king's own man to obey him from 80 miles away." He held his daughter tighter. "Get this man a chair and food and let him sleep, and let no one wake him, and when he wakes, bring him to me, for I find I have a great deal to say to him, and none of it can be said to a man asleep on his feet." They brought Corwin a chair at last. He sat down in it in the corridor, and he was asleep before the food came, and King Alaric would not let them move him, but sat with his daughter on his knee in that plain corridor, and let his best guardsman sleep at his post like a dog before a fire. And I have always thought that hour said more about the house of Harrogate than all its crowns and coronations put together. The reckoning I will tell you quickly, because justice, when it finally comes, is a plainer thing than the crime that summons it. The king heard the whole of it in his audience chamber that same afternoon, the forger Pell, weeping, and Mistress Crake, who tried at first to brazen it, and then broke when the sexton was brought in and named the night of the vigil, and the maid who had carried Crake her candle, and Lord Halbrecht with his seal-book and his nursery charter, and the Princess Adela sitting at the king's right hand as warden, which office she held in full and terrible earnest for the first time in 200 years. The copied signet was laid on the table beside the letter, and the memorial book beside them both, open to the page where the scribe Pell had, 3 years before, honestly copied out the late Queen's letters and honestly written, "Cousin," in the old fashion, the very spelling the forgery had gotten wrong, in the very hand that had gotten it wrong, so that the man's honest work stood in evidence against his dishonest, and there was no corner of it left for a lie to hide in. The Queen Consort Morwenna stood through all of it with her chin high and gave nothing away, the same dangerous animal to the last, and when the king had heard everything he asked her only one question. He asked her why. Not how, he had the how laid out on the table. Why? And Morwenna of the Westmark looked at her husband the king and said, "Because your first wife's children stand between mine and everything, and you are not so young as you were, and I have watched cleverer women than I lose everything the day their husbands die and the dead wife's son takes the chair. I would not wait to be put out. I moved first. It is what your own counselors would call statecraft, if a man had done it. It is what my own law calls treason and the forging of the royal seal and the false accusation of a child," the king said, "whoever does it." And that was the end of Morwenna as Queen Consort of Eldermoor. He did not have her killed. I want that set down, because a lesser story would end with a scaffold, and a lesser king would have obliged it. Alaric was not a lesser king. He put her aside, the marriage undone by the highest court of the realm on the grounds of treason against the king's own blood, and he sent her back to the Westmark to live out her life on her own dower lands under watch, stripped of her title and her place, and worst of all for such a woman, of her nearness to power, which had been the only air she truly breathed. Her son Cassius, who had known enough of the scheme to have spoken and had not, went with her. Her daughter Verena, who had given a grieving child a poisoned gift at Candlemas, and read a forged letter aloud in a corridor with tears she did not feel. Verena was sent to a distant and very cold and very devout house of religious women in the far north, to reflect, the king said at length, upon the difference between a sister and a snare. Mistress Crake and the scribe Pell answered to the king's justice in the ordinary way, and I will not trouble you with their portion. It was fair, and it was not gentle. And Corwin Ashe. Corwin Ashe slept 11 hours in a real bed and woke and was brought before the king as promised, and the king offered him. I had this from Corwin himself in his garden, 40 years on, and he told it laughing at his own expense. The king offered him a captaincy and lands and a place at court, the whole shining weight of a grateful crown, and Corwin Ashe turned down every particle of it. I asked His Majesty, he told me, if I might instead keep my post, the schoolroom door. He thought I was being modest and pressed the captaincy on me twice more, and I had to explain to the King of Eldermoor, who is not a stupid man but is a king, and so has strange ideas about what a man wants, that I did not want to command 100 guards at 100 doors. I wanted to stand this one. That I had promised a dead queen I would stand her children's door, and I was not finished, the youngest of them being but 6 and inclined to run at pawns. The king looked at me a long while, and then he did a thing I did not expect. He made the post itself a rank. Warden of the schoolroom door, he called it, and gave it precedence over a captaincy in his own house, so that I might keep my door, and yet no man could ever again call it a post beneath me. And then he told me to go back to it, which I did, which I have. It is where I am standing, boy, and the only part of this that matters every day since. I stood many posts, as I said, in the royal house of Harrogate and forgot most of them. That one I never could. I have told it plain as it happened, without polishing the guardsman into a saint or the queen into a devil, because the truth of it is finer than either and does not need the help. A woman with every advantage tried to steal a child's future with a forged letter and a stolen seal, choosing the one morning in 3 years when no lawful hand could stop her. And she was undone in the end, not by an army or a king, but by a doorkeeper who would not open a door, an old courtier who read an old charter, an aunt who left her fire, a scribe's honest habit, and a 9-year-old who told the truth about a thimble, and a seal because no one had ever taught her to do otherwise. Princess Maelin grew up. Of course she did, that is what the whole of it was for. She grew up under Corwin Ashe's door and her father's eye and her Aunt Adela's terrible fond attention, and she made her R sit down at last, and a great many harder letters after it, and she is on the throne now, an old woman herself, and a good and just queen, and there is not a child of the blood in Eldermoor who can be so much as looked at sideways without the whole apparatus of the nursery charter coming down like a portcullis, because she saw, at 9, exactly how close a forged word and a soft morning can come to carrying a child away, and she has spent a long reign making certain no door in her house is ever again held by only one tired man. Though she named the office after him, all the same, warden of the door. There is a guardsman standing it now, outside the schoolroom where Queen Maelin's own great-grandchildren fight their letters, and he does not know, I'd wager, why the post outranks a captaincy, or why the queen herself stops before it sometimes and stands a moment with her hand flat against the oak. But I know. I was 19, and I held a gray mare to a gallop through the water meadows in the dark, and I saw a man tell a queen that his oath did not contain the word obey. It contained the word protect, and I have never in the long years since heard a truer thing said in that or any other house. He is gone now, Corwin Ashe, this long while in the garden with him, and I am the last who stood in that corridor and remembers it whole. So I have set it down. Not for the crown which knows its own story, for the door, and for the man who would not open it,